In the early afternoon on July 21, 1945, a single aircraft initiated a terminal sequence that would linger in the record for decades. The location was the coastal water off Sonai, a settlement on Iriomote Jima in the Ryukyu Islands. Bureau records list the machine as a BuNo81095 F4U-4 Corsair, Bureau number 81095. It belonged to the United States Marine Corps Squadron VMF-212, known as the Hell Hounds, operating from Kadena Airfield on Okinawa in the final weeks of the Pacific Campaign. He pilot Second Lieutenant John F. Mugrath was 22 years old. Contemporary summaries describe him flying as part of a 12-plane division conducting close air support operations against ground facilities, but they do not consistently record a specific numbered combat mission for his personal tally. The objective was a specific infrastructure node described in wartime reporting as a small chemical plant and an administrative center. The mission required precision, and precision demanded a steep rocket dive. With underwing rockets armed, Lieutenant Mugrath committed to a high-angle run from cruising altitude, rolling over or pushing over into a dive, typically between 45 and 60 degrees so the nose could stay pinned to the aim point and rocket drop could be minimized. He tracked the target through the release envelope, and at the decision altitude, the profile allows no hesitation. Fire, then pull immediately into a high G recovery. The mechanism of recovery is governed by momentum and control authority. When the pilot pulls back on the stick, the elevators deflect up, forcing the tail down and increasing the angle of attack of the main wings. This generates lift perpendicular to the flight path, curving the trajectory away from the ground. However, the aircraft does not change direction instantly. It continues to descend due to inertia while the flight path curves upward. This phenomenon is known as mushing. The vertical distance consumed during this transition is the pull-out buffer. If the dive is too steep, the speed too high, or the initiation altitude too low, the required lift to clear the surface exceeds the structural limit of the wings or the aerodynamic limit of the control surfaces. In the case of Bureau number 81095, the cause of the failure remains technically indeterminate. Squadron reporting describes the division firing 59 rockets that day. Other pilots in the formation noted flak damage to their own aircraft, but they observed no anti-aircraft fire directed at Mugrath during his final run. The absence of a radio call or an attempted maneuver suggests two primary failure modes. The first is pilot incapacitation, potentially caused by a lucky hit from small arms fire or a physiological event. The second is a mechanical control failure, such as a severed elevator cable or hydraulic loss, rendering the stick useless. Without a flight data recorder, the distinction is academic. The outcome was a kinetic impact with the surface of the ocean. Water at impact speeds acts as a solid. The energy of the Corsair, weighing over 12,000 pounds and moving at a speed that may have approached 300 knots, was dissipated instantly upon contact. The airframe shattered. The heavy engine block and propeller assembly tore free from the lighter aluminum fuselage. The structure ceased to exist as a flying machine and became a debris field scattered across the shallow seabed. The immediate aftermath was silence. The surviving 11 aircraft in the flight returned to base. The location of the crash was marked in the squadron records, but the operational tempo of July 1945 precluded any immediate recovery attempt. The war in the Pacific was approaching its final weeks. Resources were allocated to combat, not to the retrieval of a wreck in hostile waters. The crash site was classified as a loss. Second Lieutenant Mugrath was listed as missing in action. This created the gap. For the next 43 years, the site saw no sustained official recovery effort off the coast of Sonai. The wreckage became part of the local geography, known to the residents of the town but chemically and legally separated from the entity that owned it. The saltwater environment began its slow work on the aluminum and steel. The physical evidence of the crash remained, but the connection to the pilot's identity was severed by time and politics. The central question for the recovery engineers who would eventually return was not how the plane crashed, but whether enough biological and material evidence survived the energy of the impact to prove who was inside. At near 300 knots, water turns rigid, a solid wall of physics. That breakup follows the law of kinetic impact energy. Velocity is squared, so the speed built in the dive dominates everything. that comes after. With no pullout, the aircraft carried nearly all of that velocity into the surface, and the deceleration had to occur in a fraction of a second. The load exceeded what aluminum skin, rivets, and spars can carry, so this was not a progressive crush like a low-speed ditching. It was a structural failure that tore wings from the spar and reduced the fuselage to non-aerodynamic fragments. The failure did not happen evenly, and mass determined what stayed together longest. The breakup produced a debris field that sorted itself by mass. The densest components, engine and propeller hardware, carried the highest momentum and continued downward on a clean vector. Lighter pieces, from canopy to wing skin, lost speed at the surface and were then pushed by drag, current, and tide, spreading away from the impact point. The resting place of the aircraft is located a short distance offshore of Iriomote Jima. The water here is shallow, lying on a coastal shelf that is regularly exposed to high-energy weather events. This environment introduces the concept of site stability. A wreck site in shallow water is not a static museum display. It is a dynamic system. Tides, currents, and seasonal typhoons exert constant force on the seabed. Over time, this hydraulic action acts as a filter. Loose aluminum panels and buoyant materials are lifted by storm surges and ground against the reef or washed onto the beach, where they are scavenged or corroded into dust. The heavy iron and steel components, however, tend to scour into the sediment. They become anchors. The engine block of the Corsair, weighing over 2,000 pounds, settled into the sand and coral. Once embedded, it altered the local flow of water, causing sediment to pile up around it. This burial process protects the dense metal from the worst effects of physical abrasion, although it accelerates chemical degradation. For a recovery team, this dispersal mechanism creates a difficult constraint. There is no fuselage to enter. There is no cockpit to open. The pilot station, which was the focal point of the 1988 mission, does not exist as a coherent compartment. The impact forces that strip the wings also compromise the integrity of the pilot's enclosure. Any biological evidence associated with the pilot would have been subjected to the same deceleration forces as the airframe. The survival of such evidence depends entirely on whether it was trapped beneath a heavy, stabilizing component like the engine or the armor plate behind the seat. The proximity to the shore meant the site was accessible, yet the violence of the crash concealed the critical evidence. Residents of Sonai knew the location of the iron engine, but the scattering of the lighter debris masked the presence of human remains. The ocean floor sorted the aircraft into a collection of disparate parts, hiding the pilot among the coral and sand. To resolve the status of Second Lieutenant Mugrath, investigators would need to understand this debris distribution and look not for a plane, but for the specific sediment traps where heavy debris might have shielded the pilot from the initial shredding and the subsequent 40 years of tidal scour. For decades, Bureau number 81095 remained an entry in a casualty ledger. The pilot missing, the aircraft lost. That administrative stillness carried into the late 1980s when a Department of Defense recovery effort, working with Japanese authorities, returned to Iriomote Jima to investigate the loss. The mission in 1988 was distinct from a salvage operation. The objective was not to raise the machine, but to recover the pilot. It also required a legal framework. The work could proceed only with Japanese approval inside sovereign territorial waters. With that access secured, the operation immediately ran into the same physical truth the crash created, a dispersed, high-energy debris field. The search for the pilot relied on the principle of forensic identification. This concept defines the process of correlating recovered biological material with the known service records of an individual. In a high-energy impact scenario where the airframe has fragmented and the site has been subjected to decades of tidal scouring, the expectation of finding intact remains is low. The forensic goal is to locate specific hard tissue elements or personal effects that can survive the environment. Identifiers such as dental structures or durable metal artifacts like identification tags allow investigators to build a biological profile that matches the service member's file. To achieve this, the recovery divers had to ignore the large, obvious industrial components like the engine and propeller. Instead, they focused on the sediment accumulated around the heavier debris. The engine block acted as a localized current break, creating a zone where lighter objects might settle and be buried rather than washed away. The team utilized handheld tools to carefully excavate these pockets, sifting the sand for evidence that belonged to the pilot rather than the aircraft. This process is slow and requires significant discipline, as the divers must distinguish between naturally occurring coral formations and fragmented evidence. When potential evidence is located, the operation shifts to a strict protocol known as chain of custody. This is the documentation system that tracks a piece of evidence from the moment of discovery to its final disposition in a laboratory. In a forensic recovery, the chain of custody is as important as the object itself. If the chain is broken, if the location, time, and handler of an object are not recorded, or if the item is left unsecured, its value as legal proof is nullified. The 1988 team began this documentation at the point of discovery, marking finds underwater and securing them immediately upon surfacing for formal logging and sealing. This discipline allowed recovered material to be transported from the Ryukyu Islands to an identification laboratory in Hawaii. There, specialists could compare what was recovered against the dental and medical records associated with Second Lieutenant John F. Mugrath. Public reporting describes analysis and comparison work, but the definitive outcome is not uniformly documented in publicly available records. Divers extracted only what they believed was necessary for identification, while the engine, propeller, and shattered wings were left on the sea floor. That limited recovery did not close the account. Current Department of Defense casualty lists still show Mugrath as not recovered. Even when the paperwork stays open, the wreck keeps changing. The 1988 effort concentrated on the human question. The March 2019 return shifted to the industrial timeline, what 74 years of saltwater had done to the machine itself. The team from Pacific Rex returned to the site off Sonai to execute a survey-only mission. The objective was to relocate the debris field, document the condition of the site after 74 years of saltwater immersion, and assess the identity of the airframe using observable hardware attributes. The operation began with the establishment of a survey datum. In underwater archaeology, a datum is a fixed reference point from which all other measurements are taken. Without this geometric lock, a diver is simply looking at scattered metal. By establishing a datum, the survey team can map the relative position of every component, reconstructing the disintegration pattern of the aircraft. This process was critical because the ocean floor had shifted significantly since the previous visit. The team had to reacquire the site using archival coordinates and local terrain features before they could begin the assessment. Once the field was acquired, the survey revealed the primary anchor proof of the wreck. Resting in the sand was the Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp engine. This massive component is the most durable part of a Corsair. The survey team documented the 2 rows of cylinders, totaling 18 in all. Crucially, they inspected the propeller hub attached to the crankcase. The hub featured 4 blade ports. This specific configuration is a hard technical signature. Early model Corsairs utilized a 3-bladed propeller. The presence of the 4-bladed hub strongly indicated the aircraft was an F4U-4 variant, consistent with the Bureau records for number 81095. The contrast between surviving steel and vanished skin is electrochemistry. Submerged in salt water, dissimilar metals form a corrosion cell. The more active metal becomes the anode and sacrifices itself to protect the cathode. On a World War II fighter, that means the aluminum skin is consumed while the higher-grade steel of the engine and propeller hub endures. Over 7 decades, this electrochemical reaction has systematically dissolved the thin aluminum structures of the wings and fuselage. What remains are the steel spars, the armor plate, and the engine block. The corrosion cell effectively strips the aircraft of its aerodynamic shape, leaving only the dense mechanical core. This process explains why the survey team found the engine relatively intact, encrusted with marine growth but structurally sound, while the cockpit section and tail surfaces had largely disintegrated or been buried by the shifting sands. The 2019 survey adhered to a strict non-disturbance policy. Unlike the 1988 operation, which required excavation to recover remains, this mission was purely observational. The divers photographed the engine and the surviving wing structure in situ. They verified that the heavy debris had settled firmly into the substrate. The documentation confirmed that while the pilot had been returned home, the machine remained a permanent part of the Iriomote Jima reef system. The survey closed the loop on the hardware, proving that the wreckage at the site was definitively the aircraft flown by Second Lieutenant Mugrath, held in place by its own weight and the chemistry of the ocean. The completion of the survey in 2019 presented the expedition team with a fundamental decision point. The location of the wreck was confirmed, the identity of the aircraft was verified by the engine serial attributes. The pilot had been recovered 31 years prior. The question remaining was whether the physical hardware of BuNo81095 held enough remaining value to warrant extraction, or if it served a greater function left on the seabed. This decision is governed by war-grave considerations and the legal framework surrounding sunken military craft and sovereign immunity. In the context of United States naval aviation, U.S. law and policy treat sunken military craft, including aircraft, as continuing government property unless title is formally relinquished. Regardless of the passage of time or the location in foreign territorial waters, the wreckage remains the property of the sovereign nation that operated it. This status applies even after the remains of the crew have been removed. The site retains a protected classification prohibiting unauthorized disturbance, salvage, or souvenir hunting. This principle of sovereign immunity ensures that a crash site does not become a commercial resource simply because it is accessible. For the team operating off Sonai, this protocol dictated the operational scope. The mission objective was strictly defined as non-intrusive documentation. There was no mandate to recover artifacts for a museum. To deviate from this and attempt to lift the Pratt & Whitney engine would have triggered a cascade of logistical and preservation constraints that outweigh the value of the rusted metal. The first constraint is the immediate instability of the artifact upon surfacing. As long as the steel engine and propeller hub remain submerged, they exist in a state of equilibrium with the saltwater environment. The corrosion rate, while continuous, is slow and predictable. If the engine were raised into the atmosphere, the introduction of oxygen would accelerate the oxidation process exponentially. Without immediate and expensive chemical stabilization involving months of electrolytic reduction baths, the artifact would disintegrate rapidly, turning from a solid historical marker into a pile of iron oxide dust. The second constraint is the preservation of context. The debris field, with its scattered wing structure and embedded engine, tells the story of the crash dynamics more effectively than a restored engine block on a stand. The position of the wreckage relative to the shore validates the historical record of the attack run. By leaving the components in situ, the site functions as an immutable reference point. It serves as a physical verification of the squadron war diary and the 1988 recovery report. Consequently, the Corsair was left exactly where it lay. The team recorded the site in detail, then departed without lift bags or souvenir pulls. No coral cut, no blades retrieved, nothing disturbed beyond documentation. War-grave protocol turned the wreck from a salvage target into a fixed memorial, defined less by what could be taken than by what could be learned from an undisturbed debris pattern slowly merging with the reef. The investigation into the loss of USMC F4U-4 Corsair, Bureau number 81095, concludes with a divergence of outcomes. The pilot and the machine, united in the initial kinetic event of July 21, 1945, have followed separate trajectories in the decades since. The airframe can be treated as a submerged historical site, but the official accounting for Second Lieutenant John F. Mugrath remains a matter of record rather than a closed chapter. Recovery efforts in the late 20th century sought evidence in cooperation with Japanese authorities, and later surveys documented the wreck site. However, publicly available Department of Defense accounting lists continue to show Mugrath as not recovered, so the case cannot be presented as a fully resolved repatriation. The gap between the loss and subsequent investigations spans more than 4 decades, shaped by persistence, diplomacy, and the hard limits of what survives a high-energy impact at sea. The aircraft itself faces a different future. The machine remains on the coastal shelf off Sonai, subject to the environmental forces of the Ryukyu Islands. The decision to leave the hardware in place, confirmed by the 2019 survey, acknowledges the reality of the corrosion cell. The aluminum skin of the wings and fuselage will continue to degrade, sacrificing itself to the saltwater electrolyte. Eventually, the recognizable aerodynamic forms will dissolve entirely, leaving only the dense steel components to mark the location. The Pratt & Whitney Ajar 2800 engine remains the site's enduring anchor, dense, stubborn, and hard to move. As lighter debris is scattered or consumed, That engine stays embedded in coral and sand, a physical marker that fixes the loss to a specific point on the seabed. This dual outcome, repatriation for the pilot and preservation for the plane, demonstrates the correct execution of the Wargrave Protocol. The operation balanced the moral obligation to recover the individual with the practical constraints of underwater archaeology. There was no attempt to reconstruct the aircraft for display. There was no attempt to sanitize the violence of the impact. The site is left as a raw testimonial to the energy of the crash and the final moments of the flight. Today, the wreck of BuNo81095 is a documented location, no longer a mystery, but a fixed point in the record of the Pacific campaign. The choice to survey rather than salvage preserved the site's integrity, keeping its dive geometry and unit identity readable on the seabed, as long as the engine's heavy steel remains embedded. The evidence has been weighed, the coordinates have been protected, and the machine has been allowed to rest, while the official accounting for Second Lieutenant Mugrath remains unresolved.